exploring the turbulent early years of the American Republic. The Indian Wars on the Western frontier today. We delve deeper into the formative years of the American Republic, focusing on the persistent conflicts between the United States and Native American tribes on the Western frontier that extended into the 1790s. This narrative highlights how many Native Americans, who had allied with Great Britain during the Revolutionary War, remained hostile even after peace was declared. Their reluctance to lay down their tomahawks led to one of the most devastating defeats in U.S. Army history during President George Washington's first term. This catastrophic event, surpassing even the infamous fall of Custer, was the defeat of General Arthur St. Clair on November 4, 1791, near the headwaters of the Wabash River in western Ohio. Our story is brought to life through the eyes of Massey Harbison, whose husband fought in St. Clair's army and was wounded in the battle. We will be reading excerpts from her book, A Narrative of the Sufferings of Massey Harbison from Indian Barbarity, published in 1825. This episode marks the first installment of a three-part series based on her account, The Onslaught on Western Pennsylvania Settlements. In this initial episode, we explore the early Indian attacks on settlements along the Allegheny River in western Pennsylvania. These assaults triggered General St. Clair's offensive operations against the native tribes in Ohio. Harbison's letters to Secretary of War Henry Knox, included in her book, provide a detailed first-hand account of the ensuing battles. Captivity and Resilience. The second episode recounts Massey Harbison's harrowing captivity in 1792, offering a personal glimpse into the struggles faced by settlers during this tumultuous period. Triumph and Restoration. In the final episode, we witness Mrs. Harbison's return to civilization and General Anthony Wayne's decisive victory over the Native American forces in 1795, which ultimately restored peace to the region. A personal chronicle of suffering and survival, Massey Harbison begins her narrative with a heartfelt introduction. Driven by the appeals of numerous friends who have learned of my sufferings at the hands of Indian savagery, and responding to the requests of many witnesses to the events I recount, I have resolved to share my story with a compassionate and enlightened public. I trust that readers will empathize with a woman who endured immense hardships and trials in the early settlements of our now prosperous nation. Those who enjoy peace and happiness today owe much to the perseverance and sacrifices of their predecessors. As a poor widow supporting her family through her own efforts, I present this account starting with my birth, lineage, relocation to the western frontier, and marriage. Early life amidst revolutionary struggles. Born on March 18, 1770, in Hamel Township, Somerset County, New Jersey, Harbison witnessed pivotal moments in America's fight for independence. From the battles of Long Island, Trenton, and Monmouth, she heard the roar of cannons and the chaos of war. At Westfield, she observed the brutal clashes firsthand while attending school nearby. Her father, Edward White, was a contractor for the Continental Army for 3 years, participating in every major battle except Long Island. Motivated by a love for liberty and the hope of a free nation, he fought diligently, ultimately seeing the revolution's success. Life on the frontier and the outbreak of war. After the war, in 1783, Harbison's family relocated from New Jersey to Redstone Fort on the Monongahela River in western Pennsylvania, present-day Brownsville. They thrived there until 1787 when Massey's marriage to John Harbison caused familial discord, prompting their move to the Allegheny River's headwaters. From 1789 to 1791, they prospered, but the resurgence of Indian warfare in March 1791 shattered their fortunes, stripping them of their possessions and marking the ephemeral nature of their early prosperity. Unyielding hostility and brutal conflicts, the Native Americans, embittered by their alliance with Great Britain during the Revolution, refused to abandon their violent ways even after peace. Their continued aggression resulted in the deaths, injuries, and capture of approximately 1,500 settlers, along with the theft of 2,000 horses and significant property losses between 1783 and 1790. The atrocities committed range from scalping and tomahawk strikes to horrific acts of torture and murder, leaving indelible scars on the frontier communities. The defining attack on the Russ homestead on March 22, 1791, Just 4 days after a previous assault, 7 Native Americans entered the home of Mr. Abraham Russ near Bull Creek. Under the guise of friendship, they left their rifles at the door and requested supper. Once the family was seated, the attackers turned violent, using tomahawks to murder 4 men, an elderly woman, and 6 children. They plundered the house, set it ablaze, and desecrated the victims' remains. Mrs. Derry, witnessing the brutal murder of her child and mother, attempted to escape. Despite sustaining a facial wound, she managed to break free by tearing open the house's wooden door, allowing her and several others to flee. Levi Johnson risked his life to help 17 survivors cross the icy river in a canoe, saving them from further harm. The night was harsh, forcing the escapees to trek 9 miles through treacherous woods, many nearly naked and barefoot. A community in mourning and resilience, the horrific events quickly spread throughout the region, reaching Massey Harbison and several families within a mile of the Allegheny and Kiskiminetas rivers by messengers William Critchlow and Samuel Orlate that night. This tragedy underscores the relentless struggle and resilience of frontier settlers during the early years of the American Republic. Turbulent times on the western frontier, the Harbison family's perilous journey. Upon hearing news of a brutal massacre nearby, I was struck with terror. For an hour, my family and I hurriedly packed what little we could carry. I then mounted a horse, clutching one child in my arms with another, just 4 years old, securely tied behind me to keep him safe. With only 2 months until the birth of my 3rd child, we journeyed nearly 7 miles to Mr. James Paul's home on Pine Run, arriving just as dawn broke. By sunrise, nearly 80 women and children had gathered there in search of safety, while all but 4 of the men had set out to pursue the attackers. The grim stench of burning bodies at the massacre site was so overwhelming that it nearly drove the men away. From there, they moved a mile downriver where they constructed a blockhouse near the Allegheny. Within 2 weeks, families began returning to this refuge, named Reed Station, where we would remain throughout the summer. My husband, John Harbison, enlisted in Captain Guthrie's Corps, a 6-month service under General St. Clair, destined for the Miami Village. Leaving me at Reed Station with our 3 young children, he departed on August 3rd. His return came only on December 24th, wounded and worn from the disastrous battle on November 4th, when General St. Clair suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the Native American forces. Just days later, on November 6th, tragedy struck again as Native warriors ambushed David McKee and another man near a fish basket along the river, savagely killing and scalping them. This was the final act of violence on the Allegheny for the season, marking a grim end to 1791. These early chapters from Massey Harbison's account reveal the relentless trials faced by her family and neighbors that year. In Chapter 3, she presents General St. Clair's own dispatches, capturing the grim progression of his campaign into Ohio. The correspondence begins on October 6, 1791, from Fort Washington. October 6, 1791. Fort Washington, sir. I am pleased to report that our forces departed Fort Hamilton on the morning of October 4th under General Butler's command. I've organized both march and encampment procedures. Though initially expecting 300 militia, I anticipate nearly double that soon. Our numbers, minus those stationed at Fort Hamilton, approach 2,000 regulars, excluding the militia. General St. Clair's communication continued with cautious optimism, though he recognized the logistical challenges of securing a foothold in hostile territory. A Journal of Hardships, October 22nd to October 26th. On October 22nd, General St. Clair's health waned, as persistent illnesses transformed into severe gout in his left arm. That same day, 60 militia from Kentucky arrived with provisions. The following day, amid rising tensions, 2 deserters and a soldier accused of insubordination were publicly executed before the assembled army. Later, on October 24th, Fort Jefferson was established, and the army set camp near a well-positioned water source. Illness continued to plague the general, yet he pressed on, despite increasing fatigue. By October 25th, torrential rains forced the army to halt as they awaited desperately needed provisions. On October 26th, a scouting party encountered 5 native warriors but failed to capture them, underscoring the growing challenges of navigating an unfamiliar and hostile landscape. A struggle for morale and resources on the Western Front as the Virginia Battalion faced alarming losses, including the discharge of 13 men by Colonel Dark. It was clear that promises alone weren't enough to keep the soldiers united. On October 27th, attempts were made to bolster the ranks with new levies, contingent on their commitment to serve through their enlistment, though this initiative sparked dissatisfaction among the troops. That same day, Payamingo, a native ally, arrived in camp with his warriors. Though too ill to formally engage, General St. Clair greeted them, hoping their alliance would strengthen the faltering forces. By October 28th, a shipment of essential clothing arrived at Fort Washington, providing a small but critical morale boost for the troops. Despite this, many levies remained discontented with their terms of service, a sentiment echoed privately by officers who felt that tempting soldiers with winter gear was misguided. Mr. Hodgson assured that woolen overalls and stocks, sent by General Butler's orders, were en route and would be stockpiled at Fort Jefferson. Small skirmishes erupted as native scouts fired upon troops, claiming the life of one soldier, while another went missing, possibly taken captive. The following days saw scouting parties like Payamingo's, accompanied by Captain Sparks and skilled riflemen, embarking on missions with plans to return only if they secured prisoners. Despite efforts to push forward, on October 30th, the Army advanced a mere 7 miles, hindered by an inadequate quartermaster's provision and forced to leave behind tents. The road ahead remained fraught, as deserters among the militia continued to slip away, with 60 abandoning their posts by October 31st. Suspecting a plot to raid supply convoys, St. Clair ordered the 1st Regiment to intercept them, instructing Major Hamtramck to ensure the convoy's safety and then rejoin the main forces. On November 1st, the Army paused, allowing road cutters to clear a path and giving St. Clair a moment to rest and recover. A friendly fit of the gout, as he put it, relieved him of other ailments, restoring some of his strength. Yet the trials were far from over. Reporting a crushing blow from Fort Washington, St. Clair wrote, detailing a grim conclusion. The remnants of his defeated army had returned, bearing the weight of one of the most devastating confrontations in recent memory. Despite valiant efforts, all but the detached 1st Regiment had suffered bitter losses on November 3rd near a small creek flowing southward, which St. Clair believed to be part of the River St. With courage tested at every turn and supplies thin, St. Clair's report conveys the relentless hardship and ultimate misfortune of his campaign, painting a vivid picture of the early struggles on the western frontier. The clash at Miami Village. A prelude to defeat on the afternoon of November 3rd, the U.S. Army, having marched 9 miles, reached a strategic location near the Miami Village. Encamped on high ground with the Mary Creek in front, the Army formed 2 lines. Major General Butler commanded the right wing, which included Butler's, Clark's, and Patterson's battalions, while the left wing, consisting of Bettinger's and Gaither's battalions, along with the 2nd Regiment, was led by Lieutenant Colonel Clark. An interval of about 70 yards separated the 2 wings, constrained by the limits of the terrain. The right flank was well protected by the creek's steep bank and Faulkner's Corps, while cavalry and pickets secured the left. Across the creek, a few native scouts appeared but quickly retreated upon the militia's approach. The camp was about 15 miles from the Miami Village, and that evening plans were laid with Major Ferguson to build a temporary fortification to store the men's non-essential equipment before launching an assault. The surprise attack, however, the enemy had other plans. Before sunrise on November 4th, just as the soldiers were dismissed from morning parade, a routine practice to have all men under arms before daylight, the militia stationed across the creek was suddenly attacked. They quickly crumbled under the pressure, retreating in disarray back through Major Butler's battalion, which, along with part of Clark's forces, was thrown into chaos. Despite the best efforts of the officers, order could not be fully restored, as the native warriors pursued the fleeing militia right into camp. The first line managed to momentarily halt the attackers, but a second more intense wave of assault followed. The attack rapidly spread to the second line, with the heaviest pressure focused on the center of both lines, where the artillery was positioned. The troops manning the artillery were repeatedly driven off with heavy casualties, leaving the guns vulnerable. Desperate bayonet charges, realizing that their musket fire was having little effect and that confusion was spreading as men fell in large numbers, it became necessary to turn to bayonets. Lieutenant Colonel Dark was ordered to lead a charge with part of the second line to turn the enemy's left flank. This charge was carried out with determination, and the native forces were pushed back several hundred yards. However, the U.S. troops lacked enough riflemen to exploit this success, allowing the native forces to regroup and counterattack. Soon, they breached the camp from the left flank, driving back the soldiers posted there. Despite the mounting losses, the 2nd Regiment, along with Butler's and Clark's battalions, made repeated bayonet charges. Each time, they succeeded in temporarily pushing the native forces back, but these victories came at a steep cost. The toll on officers, especially, was devastating, and with raw, inexperienced troops, these losses proved irrecoverable. The battle, though fought valiantly, was slowly slipping out of the Army's control. The decisive blow at St. Clair's defeat during the attack led by the 2nd Regiment and Butler's battalion. Major Butler was gravely wounded, and nearly every officer of the 2nd Regiment fell. Only 3 survived, including Mr. Creighton, who was seriously injured. With our artillery silenced and every officer, except Captain Ford, himself badly wounded, either killed or incapacitated, and more than half of the Army fallen, it became necessary to attempt a retreat. The remains of the Army were hastily reorganized on the right flank of the encampment. Another charge was ordered, not to defeat the enemy, but to clear the road for a retreat. The militia took the opportunity and fled down the road, followed by the regular troops. Major Clark's battalions bravely covered the rear. This retreat was, by all measures, a chaotic flight. The camp and artillery were abandoned because no horses remained to pull the equipment, even if there had been a chance to salvage it. What made the situation more disgraceful was that most of the soldiers discarded their arms and gear, even after the native forces had ceased their pursuit, which extended for about 4 miles. The road was littered with weapons for miles, a disheartening sight, but one I was powerless to correct. My own horse had been killed, and I was mounted on one too weak to move faster than a walk. The orders I sent ahead, to halt the front and prevent the men from abandoning their arms, were ignored. The disarray continued until we reached Fort Jefferson, 29 miles away, just after sunset. The battle had begun half an hour before sunrise, and the retreat was initiated around 9:30 a.m. I have yet to receive an official count of the dead and wounded, but among the fallen are Major General Butler, Lieutenant Colonel Oldham of the militia, and Majors Ferguson, Hart, and Clark. Colonel Sargent, my Adjutant General, Lieutenant Colonel Dark, Lieutenant Colonel Gibson, and Major Butler are among the wounded. The toll on our officers was particularly grievous, a loss impossible to replace in such an inexperienced army. Reflecting on a tragic loss, this defeat is not only a military catastrophe, but also a deep personal tragedy for every person who cares for the public good or shares sympathy for the suffering of individuals. I cannot fault the men for their lack of discipline. They simply had not been in service long enough to develop the necessary order and control. When thrown into confusion, it was nearly impossible to regain their composure. This lack of discipline explains why so many officers, who did their utmost to restore order, paid with their lives. My own efforts, though earnest, were hampered by illness. I was unable to mount or dismount without assistance due to my condition, and thus could not give as much as the situation required. The loss of brave officers like General Butler and Major Ferguson is particularly devastating. Their deaths cannot be mourned enough, but there is some consolation in the fact that they died valiantly, performing their duties to the very end. I owe a particular debt of gratitude to many of these officers, and to the survivors, especially Colonel Sargent. He has shown unwavering zeal, precision, and intelligence in fulfilling the many duties of his office. My aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Denny, and the Viscount Mallardy, who served with me as a volunteer, also deserve my highest respect for their invaluable assistance. With every sentiment of respect, I remain your obedient servant, Arthur St. Clair. The other side of the battle. Simon Girty's perspective. To gain insight into the battle from the opposing side, we turn to Simon Girty, a figure known for his role in the conflict as a native ally. His story, as chronicled in Simon Girty, The White Savage by Thomas Boyd, 1928, offers a unique perspective that highlights details omitted from General St. Clair's account. During the spring and summer of 1791, Girty listened as news spread along the Ohio River. General St. Clair, governor of the Northwest Territory, was facing mounting pressure to act decisively. Immigration to the territory was stalling due to fear of native attacks, and land investors were growing impatient. The general sentiment was that the native tribes should be driven further into the Ohio Territory to prevent further strikes on frontier settlers. However, St. Clair, a man of refinement and social grace, was not naturally inclined toward the rigors of military campaigns through the dense forests and treacherous rivers. Moreover, he suffered from a debilitating condition, gout, which frequently impeded his ability to lead. Despite these challenges, as governor and commander of the army, St. Clair was compelled to act. From April to September, he concentrated troops and supplies at Fort Washington. By September, he had assembled an army of roughly 2,300 men, not counting the militia. Along with the troops, St. Clair permitted between 50 and 250 women, both wives and prostitutes, to accompany the army, slowing its movements but boosting morale. This decision, while controversial, reflected the general's willingness to accommodate his men. In September, St. Clair moved his forces from Fort Washington to Fort Ludlow, 6 miles upriver, and then advanced to the Great Miami, where he established Fort Hamilton. Alongside him was Major General Richard Butler, a man with whom St. Clair shared a contentious relationship, tinged with mutual jealousy. The march to disaster. St. Clair's fateful campaign 44 miles north of Fort Hamilton. General Arthur St. Clair and Major General Richard Butler constructed a new outpost, which St. Clair named Fort Jefferson. With a string of forts behind them and accompanied by camp women, who filled the camp with gossip, St. Clair set off to engage the native forces in the wilderness. Many of the soldiers marched reluctantly, weighed down by provisions and artillery. Meanwhile, word of the army's slow advance quickly reached the native tribes. Among the first to react was Tecumseh, the Shawnee warrior whose name means shooting star. With a small band of braves, Tecumseh began shadowing the movements of St. Clair's advance guard. Soon enough, the size and position of St. Clair's army were known at Miami headquarters. This time, the native forces did not retreat. All along the Maumee River, tribes prepared for war. Blue Jacket, tall and striking in his crimson coat and red sash, called the Shawnees to arms, while the more contemplative Little Turtle rallied the Miami warriors. Captain Pipe led the Delawares, and Simon Girty, known for his fierce reputation, rode at the head of the Wyandots, adorned in a silk handkerchief and brandishing silver-mounted pistols. Together, less than 1,500 warriors set out to confront St. Clair's much larger force. The natives, unburdened by artillery and heavy supplies, had a clear advantage in mobility. In contrast, St. Clair's army was slowed by the need to cut roads through the dense forest. Adding to his challenges, St. Clair had failed to keep scouts in front of his main force, and his troops were further hampered by the presence of camp followers, including women and even a mother nursing her child. By early November, the army was camped at a bend of the Wabash River in what is now Mercer County, Ohio. The night of November 3rd passed with only a minor skirmish between some of St. Clair's volunteer scouts and a small group of native warriors. St. Clair, unaware of the full danger, was bedridden with a painful flare-up of gout. The surprise attack. November 4th, 1791. At daybreak on November 4th, the native forces launched their full-scale attack. The militia, encamped a quarter-mile ahead of the main army, was the first to face the onslaught. They quickly fell back, retreating over the snow-covered ground and across the creek towards the regulars. St. Clair, incapacitated by gout, lay helpless in his tent as chaos erupted around him. The Wyandots, led by Gertie, broke through the militia's defenses and charged into the midst of the regulars, howling as they went. Scattered American soldiers tried to hold the line, but it was not enough. Major Jacob Fowler, a second lieutenant at the battle, later described the confusion. "I saw an Indian not 20 steps off, just outside the regular lines, loading his musket behind a small tree. I took aim and shot him through. Colonel Dark, leading a charge, managed to temporarily drive the natives out of sight, but the victory was fleeting." Fowler recalled suggesting to Colonel Dark that they build a breastwork from fallen trees to protect their remaining forces. Though Dark agreed, the natives soon closed the gap again, overwhelming the American troops. The Wyandots, in particular, were relentless, cutting through the soldiers and seizing the baggage trains and artillery. By the time the Wyandots finished their assault, only 10% of Colonel Dark's men were left standing. Fowler himself narrowly escaped, firing at an Indian from close range. "I shot him through the hips, and while he crawled away, Colonel Dark, who had dismounted nearby, struck his head off with a sword." St. Clair's desperate retreat amid the confusion. General St. Clair struggled to mount a horse, calling for a retreat. His adjutant general echoed the command. Soldiers and camp followers began fleeing down the recently cleared road, pursued by native warriors. St. Clair's attempt to escape was hindered when the horse bolted, forcing him to ride off on a pack horse. Fowler rushed to inform Captain Pyatt of the retreat, but Pyatt was initially skeptical. "Don't say so. You'll discourage my men." Soon, however, the grim reality became clear as the bodies of the dead and dying surrounded them. Among the fallen was Major General Butler, who was carried to a tent for medical attention. Meanwhile, freshly scalped heads littered the frost-covered ground like pumpkins in a winter cornfield. By noon, the native forces had complete control of the battlefield. They turned to looting the American camp, wielding their scalping knives with brutal efficiency. General Butler, grievously wounded, lay helpless among the chaos. Eventually, Simon Gertie and a Wyandot warrior found him. Gertie, recognizing Butler's rank from his uniform, remarked to his companion, "Big, very big, long knife captain." The Wyandot responded with a swift tomahawk blow, killing Butler on the spot. The battlefield was a scene of devastation. Horses wandered riderless, and cattle ran aimlessly. Flour, powder, and clothing lay scattered across the snow, while the native warriors continued to pursue the retreating army for miles. One camp follower, driven mad by fear, threw her child into a snowdrift and fled back toward Fort Washington. Aftermath: by the end of the battle, the native forces had secured a stunning victory. The retreating American army made no effort to care for the wounded, and those left behind, including General Butler, were slaughtered. As the victors scoured the battlefield, the Wyandots, who had led much of the fighting, honored Gertie by presenting him with 3 captured cannons. This battle would go down in history as the largest defeat of the U.S. Army at the hands of Native American forces. General St. Clair's letters to Secretary of War Henry Knox provide a stark account of the disaster, though they omit the role of the camp followers and downplay the general's own missteps. What do you think of General St. Clair? Was he a poor leader, or were his troops simply undisciplined? Let us know in the comments. In the next episode, we'll explore a tragic event from 1792, when Massey Harbison's home was attacked by native warriors. Here we bring forgotten and neglected historical events back to life by reading from old books. If you'd like to support our mission, consider joining our Patreon or becoming a YouTube member for exclusive content.